Welcome to the debate, Family Treason, Healing the Wounds Nobody Talks About. Today we analyze the ideas from the book The Unspoken Wounds, Healing from Family Betrayal. Now this isn't a conversation about, petty squabbles or arguments over holiday dinners. We are diving into a text that reframes family dysfunction as a specific, shattering form of trauma, what the source material calls betrayal trauma. It argues that when the very people who are wired to protect us become the architects of our pain, it breaks our fundamental sense of reality.
And that is a massive claim. I'm glad we're unpacking this because, frankly, I have some serious reservations. We're living in a moment where almost any discomfort is being labeled as trauma. And I want to really examine if that's happening here. The material proposes some incredibly radical methods: unmasking hidden wounds, strictly enforcing what it calls a sanctuary, and even, refusing to forgive. So my question for today is whether this path of liberation is actually healing, or if it's just a recipe for isolation and bitterness.
That tension is exactly why we're here. But let's be clear about the premise before we tear it down. The core argument is that family betrayal is distinct because it involves our primary attachment figures. We're not talking about a bad boss or a rude neighbor. We're talking about the people who, literally built your brain. The theory posits that for a child or even a dependent adult, acknowledging that a parent is harmful is a threat to their survival. So the brain engages in betrayal blindness. It effectively deletes or dissociates from the reality of the harm to preserve that connection. It's not a victim mentality, it's a sophisticated biological survival mechanism.
Okay, I don't deny that severe abuse causes trauma. If we're talking about physical violence or, profound neglect, sure, the brain does what it has to do. But this framework casts a much, much wider net. And that's where I start to struggle. It groups financial betrayal and relational betrayal, things like favoritism or triangulation, under the same umbrella as severe assault. When we tell someone that their mother preferring their brother is a shattering impact equivalent to physical abuse, are we really helping them, or are we encouraging a shattered reality mindset where they start to see themselves as permanently broken?
See, you're focusing on the method of the harm, but the theory focuses on the source and the impact. Take financial betrayal. We aren't just talking about borrowing $20 and forgetting to pay it back. We're talking about a guardian leveraging a child's identity for credit or withholding resources to control them. That's a fundamental violation of autonomy. It teaches the child, I do not own myself. Or look at relational betrayal, like triangulation, where a parent uses one child to manipulate another. This absolutely destroys the sense of belonging. The damage isn't the lost money or the hurt feelings. The damage is the breach of trust by a protector. It creates what the text calls silent echoes, these patterns of self-doubt that reverberate for decades. If you minimize that as just messy family stuff, you are asking the victim to gaslight themselves.
But where does it end? I mean, if we validate every single negative emotion as a breach of trust, we risk creating a society of people who just cannot handle conflict. Let's look at the proposed solution, because that's where the rubber really meets the road. The methodology here suggests building a sanctuary. It talks about time boundaries, communication boundaries, and financial boundaries with military precision. In the real world, telling your mother, I have a communication boundary regarding this topic, doesn't lead to a breakthrough. It leads to what this very framework calls the retaliation. It creates a war. By pushing this clinical approach, aren't we just replacing the so-called invisible chains of family obligation with the very real isolation of a lonely fortress?
The war is already happening. That is the critical point you're missing. The chaos is already there. It's just being absorbed entirely by the victim to keep the peace. The boundary-setting roadmap isn't about being cold or aggressive. It's about the art of self-preservation. The goal isn't conflict, it's reclaiming your narrative. If setting a simple boundary, saying, I will not discuss my weight with you, causes a complete family meltdown, that meltdown just proves the boundary was necessary in the first place. The theory argues that if your relationship requires you to be silent and submissive just to exist, it's not a relationship. It's a hostage situation.
A hostage situation? That is incredibly dramatic language for what might just be an overbearing mother. And this brings me back to the diagnosis itself. Betrayal blindness. The claim is that victims must be unaware of the betrayal to survive. Scientifically, okay, that's plausible for a small child. But we're applying this to adults looking back. So how does an adult distinguish between genuine betrayal blindness and just, well, remembering things differently later in life? If I suddenly decide at 30 that my parents' strictness was trauma, am I uncovering a suppressed truth? Or am I just reframing a normal struggle to fit a narrative that absolves me of my own failures?
That's why the framework relies on cognitive dissonance as the indicator, not just memory. Cognitive dissonance is that uncomfortable, almost nauseating tension of holding two conflicting beliefs about the same person. For example, my mother is a saint versus my mother sabotages my success. The brain literally cannot hold both, so betrayal blindness kicks in to erase the second one so you can keep the first. We're not rewriting history, we're unwriting the false narrative we had to create to survive. It's about finally validating that nameless ache that the person has felt their whole life but couldn't articulate because they were too busy protecting their parents' image.
Okay, unwriting the false narrative sounds noble, but let's look at the practical fallout. You mentioned relational betrayal earlier, specifically like toxic sibling rivalry or being the family scapegoat. Families play favorites. It's unfair, it is painful, but is it trauma? Trauma implies a physiological rewiring of the nervous system. Are we really saying that being the less favorite child requires the same level of recovery as escaping a war zone? Because if everything is trauma, then nothing is trauma.
It absolutely is trauma because of who is doing it. If a stranger prefers someone else over you, it's just a preference. If a parent, the architect of your reality, consistently validates one sibling and invalidates another, it creates identity fragmentation. The child learns, I am not the one who is worthy of love, I am the one who is worthy of service. That belief doesn't just vanish when you move out. It becomes the operating system for every future relationship. You end up marrying people who treat you like a second choice. You work for bosses who exploit you. The breach of trust by a protector fundamentally compromises your ability to trust your own perception of reality. That is a brain injury, not just a sad memory.
If we accept that premise, that the operating system is corrupted, then we have to look at the patch this framework proposes. And this is where I get very skeptical about the whole sanctuary concept. It treats family management like it's a legal contract. Phase 1, identification. Phase 2, communication. Phase 3, enforcement. It even advises on managing the resulting guilt by reframing it as self-love. But families are complex, messy, organic systems. You can't just draw a line in the sand without expecting a tidal wave. If you enforce these boundaries, you risk losing your support network, your inheritance, access to nieces and nephews. Is the sanctuary really worth the cost of total excommunication?
You're asking if the sanctuary is worth the cost, but the framework asks, what is the cost of staying? The cost isn't just annoyance, it's chronic anxiety. It's CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which comes from prolonged exposure to emotional captivity. It's autoimmune issues that are caused by living in a constant state of high cortisol. The argument is that the support network you're so afraid of losing is a mirage if it requires you to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. If your inheritance depends on you accepting abuse, you're not a beneficiary, you're an employee.
That sounds empowering on paper, but release, which is the polite term this theory uses for no contact, that's a nuclear option. It creates a permanent severance. And then we have this concept of a chosen family offered as the alternative. That sounds lovely, like something from a sitcom. But chosen families don't share your DNA, your history, or your legal obligations. When you get sick, when you run out of money, is your chosen family going to be there the way a biological family feels obligated to be? I worry that advising people to release difficult family members encourages this disposable view of relationships. You hurt me, you're gone. Where's the resilience? Where is the sticking it out through the hard times?
Sticking it out is only a virtue if there's mutual effort. The framework for navigating relationships is very specific about this. It doesn't say cut everyone off at the first sign of trouble. It says reconciliation is possible if, and this is a huge if, there is accountability and a willingness to change. If a relationship is irrevocably toxic and the betrayer shows no capacity for remorse, then sticking it out isn't resilience, it's masochism. It's just re-traumatization over and over. And as for chosen family, the argument is that shared DNA is a biological accident, not a suicide pact. Finding people who offer genuine safety and reciprocity is healthier than relying on people who only offer obligation and criticism.
Okay, let's pivot to the most controversial philosophical stance here, the forgiveness crossroads. This approach explicitly states not forgiving can sometimes be the healthiest choice. This flies in the face of almost every spiritual and psychological tradition we have. We're taught that forgiveness is for you, not them. We're taught that holding on to a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But this framework suggests that sometimes the poison is actually the forgiveness itself. That feels dangerous.
It feels dangerous because it challenges a social order that often protects abusers. We need to distinguish between decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness. Decisional is just the choice to stop seeking revenge. Emotional forgiveness is that feeling of peace and restoration. The problem is that society, and often the family, pressures victims into decisional forgiveness before they're even safe. Just say you're sorry and hug your uncle. That bypasses the processing of the harm. It forces the victim to prioritize the aggressor's comfort over their own healing. That is what leads to compromised self-worth.
But isn't the refusal to forgive just a mechanism to stay angry? The theory talks about releasing the need to forgive, but that sounds like semantic gymnastics to me. If I don't forgive you, I am still holding the debt against you. And if I hold the debt, I'm still tied to you. You're still taking up space in my head.
Not necessarily. The concept of radical reassessment argues that forgiveness usually implies a restoration of the relationship or a minimization of the harm. Releasing the need to forgive means stepping off the playing field entirely. You aren't waiting for an apology, you aren't trying to fix them, and you aren't granting absolution. You are indifferent. You accept that they are who they are and you walk away. The text argues that forcing forgiveness when there is ongoing harm or no remorse teaches the victim that their pain doesn't matter. It keeps the door cracked open for the abuser to come back in. The alternative path to peace is accepting that some things are unforgivable, and that's okay. You can still be happy without forgiving the person who broke you.
Indifference is a very high bar to clear. Most people oscillate between love and hate, not true indifference. And this leads to the outcome promised here: identity beyond betrayal and post-traumatic growth. The idea is that we can reclaim our narrative. But I have to ask, is this pressure to have post-traumatic growth just another burden? Now, not only was I betrayed, but if I don't turn it into a superpower and become a stronger, more enlightened person, have I failed at healing too? Are we romanticizing trauma by demanding it lead to growth?
That's a risk, certainly. But the perspective here isn't about becoming a superhero. It's about stripping away the assigned roles. In a betrayal dynamic, you are often cast as the scapegoat, the problem, or the invisible one. Reclaiming your narrative is simply the act of rejecting that casting call. It's defining your self-worth internally rather than waiting for the family to approve of you. It's not about, thank you for the trauma because it made me strong. It's, I am strong despite the trauma, and I define who I am now. That is the shift from just surviving to actually living.
I see the appeal of that autonomy, I do, but I keep coming back to the sheer energy this requires. The constant monitoring of boundaries, the authentic self-audits, the mindfulness practices, the construction and maintenance of this sanctuary. It feels like this approach turns your life into a full-time job of trauma management. You become the CEO of your own misery.
It is absolutely work, but you have to compare it to the alternative. Is it more work than the silent echoes? Is it more exhausting than the chronic invalidation, the gaslighting, and the invisible chains of trying to please people who cannot be pleased? The argument is that the energy is being spent regardless. You are either spending it on managing their dysfunction, or you are spending it on building your own peace. One drains you, the other eventually sustains you.
So, as we look at this manual for, let's call it what it is, a family revolution, where do we land?
I think the ideas in the unspoken wounds provide a vital vocabulary. For years, people have felt these things: the dizziness of cognitive dissonance, the ache of triangulation, without having the words to describe them. By naming the ghost, you can finally fight it.
And I'll concede that the validation is powerful. If you are in a situation of severe abuse or neglect, this framework could be a lifeline. But I maintain my skepticism for the gray areas. For the families that are just difficult or annoying or flawed, applying this level of rigidity, the no contact, the refusal to forgive, might be using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. You risk ending up with a very secure but very empty fortress. And silence can be just as deafening as conflict.
And I would counter that what looks like a nut to an outsider might feel like a sledgehammer to the person living it every single day. The logic here proves that your own peace is more valuable than keeping the peace for everyone else. If the invisible chains of family loyalty are choking you, maybe the risk of the sanctuary is worth the reward of thriving after the storm.
It certainly forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths. It asks us to look at loyalty and ask if it's actually servitude.
Exactly. It forces you to decide if you're ready to unmask the offense, or if, as you suggest, some doors are better left closed just to keep the house standing.
A decision every listener has to make for themselves.
Absolutely. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
See you next time.